What do the winners have in common? What is a key to success? The only thing that the winners have in common is that they're good. I mean, they're different genders, they're different races, they come from different parts of the country. And in the case of the state winners, they come from different parts of the state. So there's no commonality in that one. But they're all very controlled and considerate readers, and they know their stuff. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of success in this, and the success in anything, is preparation. And if something goes wrong and you've prepared, you have ways to get around. What's the craziest thing that's happened to you while you've been reading or reciting a poem in front of an audience? I've been thinking about this a lot because just had a bunch of students recite poems for a grade, and I realized how scared they were to be doing this in front of everybody. And because it takes a particular kind of bravery, doesn't it, to stand up and read poems. But I think the craziest thing that ever happened to me was reading at the National Book Award finals with the other 19 finalists. It was an amazing evening, full of very fancy writers and generous people. And when I got up to read, I forgot the poems I wanted to read. So then I found the poems in my book, and then I lost my page in the book. So first I forgot what I wanted to read because I was all like starstruck. And then while I was reading, I lost the page while I was reading, and it was incredibly embarrassing. I was sitting there flipping through trying to find it without anybody seeing it. I don't know. I mean, it turned out okay.
No tripping and falling ever?
No, I never did nothing like that. But that was like kind of a metaphoric tripping and falling. You know what I mean? Because it really was. I was sitting there, and actually at this reading, when I lost my page, I was trying to play it off and find it. So I was looking up and keeping my sort of posture, which is one of the things that you need to do in poetry out loud. And I was looking around, making sure that it seemed like I wasn't flustered. But underneath, I was like flipping these pages. And the only people who could see were the people in the front row, the other finalists. So they saw me flipping through as I was reciting the poem, trying to find my page. And it was incredibly embarrassing. But it worked out. I mean, nobody except for the people in front knew what a disaster it actually was. How do you choose the right poems from the huge anthology? Well, that's a really tricky question because one of the poems has to be from the previous to the 20th century, right? And they have to be, one of them has to be less than 25 lines. And so there are a lot of different kinds of poems that fall in those categories. Generally speaking, most of the participants pick one poem pre-20th century and two poems that are more contemporary. And then it becomes a thing about what you value. I like poems that sound good, that have very sonorous cadences, so I would look for those. Poems that sort of intersect with your personal experience are really good to read. And also poems that inspire you somehow. Those seem to work well. So, would you suggest saving the strongest poem for the third round or performing it early to make sure the student gets into the program? That's a really great question, and it comes up, I think, a lot because so many of the participants are talented and they're really strong readers and have a great presence. So then the question becomes, if you save the best for last, will the other two poems be enough to get you into the finals? And as far as I'm concerned, all three poems should be great, so there shouldn't be necessarily a best one. But if there is one that you feel more strongly about, I would lead with it. I wouldn't wait till the end. All right. What is your favorite poem to recite? Well, my poems are my favorite poems to recite, so it's kind of a weird thing to say. But I guess if I was going to pick someone else's poem, probably one of Yusef Komunyaku's poems, maybe You and I Are Disappearing, or Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays, is a poem that I really like. I don't think they're in the anthology, but there's one of my poems in the anthology.
Which of your own are your favorite to recite? Or does it change over time?
Yeah, it changes. I mean, my favorites change. Yesterday, I did 3 readings in a row at Columbus North. And by the end of it, my favorite poem to read was the poem Unfunky UFO that's actually in the anthology. That's why I was thinking about it. It wasn't a plug for me as much as it was I just got finished reciting that poem like 3 straight times. But usually my favorite poems are stuff to read from The Big Smoke because it's dramatic. Yeah. What areas are we going to be judged on? The rules are pretty thorough, and so I think we're going to just post those as a link following this. Okay. Tell us what judges look for to see evidence of understanding. How can judges tell if a student really gets the meaning of what they're reading? So that's a great question. It's one of the toughest things to judge, but I think it's safe to say that this sort of the patterns of behavior, the way that the students carry themselves, the way that they recite the poem, the cadences of the recitation, I think all of that ties into evidence of understanding. If a poet is reciting a poem that is sad and they seem really peppy and upbeat, it doesn't seem like they really get what the poem was about. It's just as an easy example. I remember somebody reading a poem about, reciting a poem about like the death of a father, and it seemed like they were singing the show tune, and it seemed like all of the judges were like, okay, I don't think that this student understands what this poem is really about. So maybe one way to think about that is to really consider the subject matter and the musicality of the poem and tailor the recitation to that. What are some tips on use of gesture or body language? Can you explain the line between gestures that assist in the interpretation of a poem and those which distract from the overall performance? So the whole performance is supposed to be about the words. It's not supposed to be about the body. So the more it becomes about the body, the more distracting it is from the words. So any kinds of large gestures are going to get, you're going to have a deduction for those. So the more sort of in control that the student can be, the more in control that the person reciting the poem can be, the better it will be in terms of that part of the judging. How does a performer gauge their dramatic appropriateness? How do you know when you are emoting too much? How do you know when you've gone over the top? Well, I think this is also where the coaches come in. I think coaches are really useful for this because sometimes we think we're being appropriate in our behaviors and it doesn't really come off that way to the people outside. So being aware of the fact that there is a tone and there is a kind of body language that's appropriate for poems will help you sort of stay in control. Anything that becomes effusive, anything that gets like this is going to be too much. It doesn't matter what the poem is about. So if you find, or if a student who's reciting a poem finds themselves doing like they're about to speak to the skull in a Shakespeare play, then it's too much. Well, also the volume is a part of that, but because there's a microphone, you have to be acutely aware of it. Just a little bit of a raise in the voice changes the appropriateness of it in terms of whether or not it's too much. Okay, at what age/how did you realize your passion for poetry? I didn't start writing poems until I was in college. So any of the students who are writing their own work right now are way ahead of where I was. I wanted to be a rapper, and luckily I figured out that I was really bad at it before I embarrassed myself anymore. But that was the genesis of my enthusiasm for words, which then, when I was in college, offered the opportunity for poetry. So when it comes to poetry ourselves, what do the judges look for in a good poem? Well, that's a really capacious question. And there are a lot of different things that go into making a good poem. But when I was one of the judges for it, the thing I looked for most was to be surprised and also poems that sounded good. Those were the two things that I was really interested in. Anything that I didn't feel like I'd seen before made it to the top of the list. What would you say to a student who's very nervous about performing on stage? I would say to, and what I said to my students when it was their turn to recite, is that if you're not nervous, it means you don't care, and if you don't care, there's no way you'll win. So embrace your care.